The golden soft morning sun poured into the Almeida vineyard, painting the stone walls and polished wood floors with dancing reflections. There, amidst the respectful silence of the barrels and the sweet perfume of fermentation, was Isabella, a sommelier with an unwavering smile and a contagious passion. She moved with the grace of someone who belonged, arranging crystal glasses in a perfect choreography. Her impeccable white apron was the uniform of a guardian of secrets, not just of the wines, but of her own. Isabella had become the face of the winery, the symbol of its tradition and warmth, a beacon of joy that seemed never to dim. Yet behind that smile, there was a silent wall she had built years ago, a solemn promise to herself never to let sadness conquer her again. This promise was a burden she carried with the lightness of someone pretending not to feel its weight. She knew that her promise not to cry was armor, and that just as wine needs to age to become sublime, pain needs to be processed to transform. But she refused to do it. Instead of facing the past, she had bottled it and sealed it, like a wine that would never be opened. In that moment, in her methodical routine, the peace of the environment was broken. Rumors of the arrival of Rodrigo Almeida, the heir returning to modernize the winery, stirred the calm waters of her existence. She had heard stories of his coldness, his pragmatism, and how he saw the winery only as a business, not a home. For Isabella, the winery was an extension of her family, the legacy her mother had once taught her to love. Rodrigo's imminent presence was a premonition, a warning that the tranquility she so cherished was about to be disturbed. The tasting room door opened with a slight creak, and Rodrigo's presence filled the space. He didn't walk, he marched, and each step was an affirmation of his authority. His grey, analytical eyes didn't linger on the beauty of the room, but focused on Isabella. He saw her not as a person, but as an item to be catalogued. Her smile, which melted most hearts, was to him just a facade, cheap marketing. He had studied the numbers and knew that the winery's sentimentalism was a metric that needed to be corrected. He detested the romanticism embedded in tradition because, in his mind, passion was a trap, a dangerous distraction. His attitude was that of a surgeon ready to operate without caring about the patient's pain. He was there to cure the company's financial sickness, even if it meant cutting out the emotions that kept it alive. Rodrigo stopped at a safe distance, as if the contagion of happiness could be transmitted through the air. "Good morning," he said, his voice a dry, inflectionless monologue. Isabella, used to cordiality, replied with her trademark sweetness. "Good morning, Mr. Almeida. Welcome back." He nodded, but his eyes continued to inspect her, stopping at her smile as if trying to decipher a riddle. "Is it true that you're responsible for the entire our product presentation?" He used the word product as if he were talking about an inanimate object, not the passion of a lifetime. She felt a twinge of offense, but didn't let it show. "I'm the sommelier, Mr. Almeida. My job is to tell the story of each wine." Her answer didn't satisfy him, though. He shook his head in denial. The conflict, which had been just a shadow on the horizon, took on shape and color. "Stories don't pay bills," he retorted, his voice gaining an intensity that made her step back slightly. "The reports show we're losing market share to more modern wineries. Your sentimentalism, your story, is costing us dearly." His words were like small stones thrown against her armor, and she felt the first crack in her smile. She took a deep breath, remembering her promise, and held her composure. "The story is what makes us different, Mr. Almeida. It's what makes our wine more than just a drink. It's what makes it an experience." He just watched her, an air of superiority, hanging over him. To Rodrigo, her words were pure poetry, but poetry made no sense on a business spreadsheet. He saw her as a relic, a part of the tradition that needed to be discarded. With each word, the barrier between them grew. Isabella, who was an open book to most, became an enigma for Rodrigo to decipher. He noticed the way she avoided direct eye contact when she spoke of her passion, as if there was something she didn't want him to see in her eyes. Her joy, so exuberant, seemed like a curtain for something deeper and perhaps darker. He, who hated sentimentalism, was being drawn into the mystery she represented. The way she held the bottles, with an almost reverent care, or how she described each wine vintage with an eloquence that seemed to come from a place of deep memory, intrigued him. He, who believed that everything could be quantified, couldn't quantify her passion, and that bothered him deeply. The day continued with a silent tension. Rodrigo watched Isabella's every move from afar, like a predator sizing up its prey. He saw her interact with visitors, the way she made them laugh, how she guided them through the tasting process with a patience and charisma he couldn't understand. He saw her pick up a bottle of wine with a dusty label and hold it as if it were a sacred artifact. It was one of the bottles from the first vintage, one of the winery's treasures. The way she ran her fingers over the bottle, as if stroking a pet, made him feel a pang of something he couldn't identify. It was a mixture of repulsion for the sentimentalism and a strange attraction to the depth of that gesture. He approached her, the silence between them heavy. "That bottle isn't for sale," he said, his voice softer than usual, but still authoritative. "It has no commercial value." Isabella looked at him, and for a moment the curtain of her smile dropped, revealing a glimpse of sadness in her eyes. "It's not about commercial value, Mr. Almeida. It's the story. It's the first bottle ever produced. It's the beginning of everything." The way she spoke, with a reverence he didn't understand, made him stop. He saw for a second a glimpse of the woman behind the mask of joy. It was a woman who had suffered, who kept secrets, and who found in the winery's tradition a refuge from her pain. The revelation was short, but enough to break Rodrigo's certainty. He had categorized Isabella as a superficial employee, but the intensity of her reaction to the wine bottle showed him she was more than she seemed. He, who had promised himself never to get involved in emotions again, was being pulled into Isabella's silent drama. The conflict between them, before purely ideological, gained a new, personal and emotional layer. He felt a strange need to unravel her mystery, to discover what made her smile so much and what made her keep such deep secrets. He, the man of numbers, was being confronted with life's most illogical and unquantifiable side, the human heart. That was the first of many silent confrontations. Rodrigo continued to criticize her, question her methods, and propose changes that, to her, were an affront to the winery's soul. He spoke in numbers, efficiency, profit, while she spoke of tradition, legacy, passion. The air between them was always charged, a mix of tension and a strange attraction. Each day, he became more fascinated by the woman who, despite everything, kept a smile on her face. He found himself watching her, trying to find the crack in the armor, the moment her happiness would crumble. He wanted her to be real, to show the pain he knew existed. He wanted to see what she was hiding. Isabella, for her part, felt the pressure of Rodrigo's presence, but refused to yield. The winery was her sanctuary, and he was a storm trying to invade it. She clung to her promise not to cry because, to her, crying was a sign of weakness. She knew that modernization was necessary, but not at the cost of the place's soul. She remembered her Mother's words, who said that wine was a mirror of the winemaker's soul. If the soul was full of joy, the wine would be vibrant, but if it was full of sadness, the wine would be bitter. And she refused to let Rodrigo's sadness contaminate the Almeida family's wine, which was, in essence, her own mother's legacy. One of the employees, who had worked at the winery for years, approached Isabella in a moment of silence and touched her shoulder. "Be careful with him, Isa. His father was like that." 2. Cold, calculating, but he hid his sadness for a long time. The employee's words, said in a whisper, were a warning. The sadness wasn't just Rodrigo's, but a family inheritance. The information took her by surprise, making her question the origin of his coldness. What had happened to the Almeida family for joy to be banished from their lives? She felt a pang of compassion, but quickly extinguished it. He was the enemy, the one who wanted to destroy everything she loved, and she couldn't afford to feel pity for him. From that moment on, Isabella began to observe Rodrigo more closely. She saw that he wasn't just cold, but also lonely. He worked late, ate alone, and his eyes, no matter how much he tried, couldn't hide the pain he carried. She caught him one night, looking at the bottle from the first vintage with an expression of melancholy that contrasted with his usual demeanor. In that moment, she felt that the conflict between them was more than a battle of ideas. It was a battle of wounded hearts. Her mother's promise never to cry seemed less important than understanding what had happened to the Almeida family. On another day, Rodrigo surprised her in the office, reading an old diary with a worn leather cover. It was her mother's diary. "What's that?" he asked, his voice more curious than accusatory. She was startled, quickly closing the diary and putting it in her pocket. "Nothing, Mr. Almeida, just some old notes." But her reaction was enough to pique Rodrigo's curiosity. He noticed the way she held the diary with the same reverence she held the wine bottle, and he felt, inexplicably, that the secret she kept was connected to the secret his family was hiding. That diary, he felt, was the key to the truth. The initial clash of personalities between Isabella and Rodrigo evolved into a complex dance, a mixture of clashes and moments of rapprochement that forced them out of their comfort zones. The winery, once the stage for their separate lives, became the setting for their forced collaboration. A problem with one of the autumn harvests brought them together unexpectedly. Rodrigo, with his analytical mind, detected a flaw in the irrigation systems that could compromise the quality of the grapes. Isabella, with her sensitivity and practical knowledge of the land, was able to identify the cause and suggest a solution that, to the pragmatic Rodrigo, seemed magical. They complemented each other, and this discovery, though reluctant, was the first step to tearing down the barriers they had built between themselves. The tense silence from before was replaced by more focused communication, even if it was still laden with subtext and veiled provocations. Their professional partnership deepened when they began working on a new wine, the Reconciliation Blend, an idea of Isabella's that Rodrigo surprisingly accepted. He, the man of numbers, saw the marketing potential in the story behind the wine. She, the woman of heart, saw the opportunity to create something that represented her family's legacy and the winery's future. They spent hours together, discussing notes, flavors, and the intensity of fermentation. The smell of grapes and yeast enveloped them, creating an intimate environment that both consciously or unconsciously desired. With each decision about the wine, they learned a little more about each other, and the respect, once non-existent, began to grow. They were no longer enemies, but partners. The attraction between them which started as a spark, was becoming a flame. With each confrontation, they got to know each other a little more, and with each discovery, the barrier between them shrank. Rodrigo, the man of numbers, was being confronted with life's most human and illogical side. Isabella, the woman with the smile, was being confronted with the pain she had promised herself she would never feel. The winery, once a refuge for her, was becoming a battlefield, but also a place of discovery. The bottle from the first vintage, her mother's diary, and Rodrigo's lonely gaze were the symbols of a mystery that was about to be unraveled. The story, which began with the collision of two souls, was just beginning. The narrative gained a new layer of conflict with the arrival of a rival, a wine market magnate who wanted to buy the winery. He was the opposite of Rodrigo, a businessman with a fake smile and an undisguised coldness. He saw the winery as an asset, not a legacy. The magnate, named Arthur, used dirty tactics to pressure the sale, and Rodrigo and Isabella united to fight against him. The fight against an external enemy united them even more deeply, and they became a team, a duo. Arthur's presence forced them to trust each other, to work together, and to fight for something that for both of them was more than a business. It was the soul of the winery. The climax of the second act began to form when one of Rodrigo's relatives, an aunt, came to visit. The aunt, a kind woman, with sad eyes, noticed the closeness between Rodrigo and Isabella, and in a moment of intimacy, she mentioned a family secret. She told the story of Rodrigo's mother, a woman who loved life and wine, but had died in a car accident when Rodrigo was still very young. The trauma of the loss and the way Rodrigo's father had become cold and distant shaped him into the man he was today. Sentimentalism for him was a painful reminder of something he had lost forever. The aunt's revelation was just the tip of the iceberg. She also mentioned Isabella's mother's diary, who, by a twist of fate, had been one of Rodrigo's mother's best friends. The aunt didn't know the diary's content, but knew there was a mystery behind Rodrigo's mother's death, and that Isabella's mother was involved. The news left her shocked, and she felt the weight of a secret that wasn't hers, but directly involved her. The promise not to cry, which she had made to herself, seemed more impossible than ever. The mystery that united her with Rodrigo was about to be unraveled. Isabella, overcome with curiosity and pain, decided to read her mother's diary. The words, which were once just a portal to the past, were now the key to the truth. The diary told the story of the friendship between the two mothers and the secret they shared. Isabella's mother had been the last person to see Rodrigo's mother alive. They had argued, a confrontation about Rodrigo's mother's passion for a man who wasn't her husband, and Isabella's mother had refused to tell the truth. Rodrigo's mother had left furious and gotten into the car, and the accident had happened. Isabella's mother carried the guilt for the rest of her life, and the diary was her confession, her plea for forgiveness. The revelation hit her like a punch to the stomach. The smile she had maintained for so long fell apart, and the tears she had promised herself she would never shed began to roll down her face. She felt betrayed by her mother and betrayed by herself. She could no longer hide behind the mask of joy. The diary was proof that Rodrigo's pain was, in part, her family's fault, and she knew that to be free, she would have to tell him the truth. It was a difficult decision that could destroy what they were building, but it was the only way to find peace. The climax of the narrative happened when she, with the diary in her hand, confronted Rodrigo. They were in the tasting room, the same place they had met. "I know what happened," she said. Her voice choked with emotion. He looked at her with the expression of someone who doesn't understand but knows that something important is about to be revealed. She opened the diary and with a trembling voice began to read her mother's words. He listened in silence, the coldness of his face crumbling, giving way to an expression of shock and disbelief. The truth was more painful than he had ever imagined. The words of the diary, which were supposed to be a secret, became the bridge that would unite them. Rodrigo, who had always lived in the darkness of pain, was being confronted with the truth. He couldn't blame Isabella, but the pain, the anger, the sadness hit him hard. He felt betrayed by his father, by his family, by fate. The winery, which he had seen as a business, became the scene of a tragedy, and he felt guilty for not having sought the truth sooner. The revelation was a shock for both of them, and the narrative's climax was a moment of pain, but also of liberation. The story deepened, taking on a dramatic and heavy tone. The romantic comedy became a family drama, and the love they were building became a matter of forgiveness and acceptance. They separated, each dealing with the pain in their own way. Isabella, with her mother's diary in her hands, felt free from the promise that had imprisoned her, but also felt a greater weight, the weight of the responsibility to tell the truth. Rodrigo, with a broken heart, felt betrayed by his family and the winery once. A place of business became the scene of a personal tragedy. They could no longer hide behind their masks. Isabella and Rodrigo's separation, however, was only temporary. The pain of being apart was greater than the pain of being together. Rodrigo, alone in the tasting room, realized that the coldness that defined him was just the absence of warmth. Isabella, at home with the diary in her hands, realized that the smile that defined her was just the absence of tears. They were the opposite of each other, but also reflections of themselves, and the only way to heal themselves was by healing the other. They were mirrors of each other's souls, and the reflection they saw was proof that love was the only thing that could heal them. The silence in the winery after the revelation was heavier than the noise of any storm. Isabella, alone in her small apartment, finally allowed the wall of her smile to crumble. Tears she had promised herself she would never shed again rolled down her face. No longer as a sign of weakness, but as a river that had finally found the sea. She cried for her mother, for the secret that suffocated her, and for the pain that unknowingly had been passed on to Rodrigo. The diary, now stained with her tears, was both a burden and a liberation. With each of her mother's words, she felt the pain, the guilt, the search for forgiveness. The promise not to cry, which had imprisoned her for years, was broken. And instead of feeling defeated, she felt free, ready to face the truth, no longer as a victim, but as a woman who had accepted her past. Meanwhile, Rodrigo, in his solitude in the tasting room, processed the truth in the most painful way possible. The coldness that defined him, the cynicism that protected him, crumbled into ruins. The pain he had encapsulated his entire life emerged with overwhelming force. He felt like a wine that had soured, lost, betrayed by his own family's history. His father, who had become a stranger after his mother's death, was now a liar, and the winery, once a place of business, became the stage for a personal tragedy. He felt guilty for having judged Isabella, for her joy, for her passion, when she, unknowingly, was the guardian of a secret that inescapably united him with her. The reconciliation, however, began subtly, with small gestures. Rodrigo, in a moment of introspection, found a note in the tasting room. It was a note from Isabella with a single sentence: "Wine like forgiveness, needs time to mature. The message hit him with unexpected force. He, the man who lived by numbers, was being confronted with the poetry of forgiveness. The metaphor of wine, which he so despised, now made sense. He looked at the bottle from the first vintage, which he had broken in a moment of fury, and realized that anger was just the absence of forgiveness. The narrative gained a new rhythm with the slow, thoughtful pace of forgiveness. Rodrigo, who had always acted on impulse, began to reflect on his life, on the pain that had shaped him, and on the need to free himself. He remembered his mother, a woman who loved life and wine, and realized that the best way to honor her was not with coldness, but with passion. He, who had promised himself he would never get involved in emotions again, was drowning in a sea of feelings. The winery, once a place of business, became the site of a personal journey. He felt like a grape, ready to be crushed by the truth, but also ready to be transformed into a new wine. He searched for her in every corner of the winery, in the aging cellars, in the vineyards, in every place they had shared. With each step, he felt her presence, the energy of her passion, the warmth of her joy. He was no longer looking for her to judge her, but to forgive her. He wanted her to know that he forgave her, and that he also forgave himself. He wanted her to know that the pain that had separated them now united them. He was looking for her to say that the coldness that defined him was just the absence of the warmth she brought. He was looking for her to say that love was the only thing that could save them. The final meeting happened in one of the vineyards at night. The full, bright moon illuminated the two of them, who looked at each other from afar. Isabella, with her mother's diary in her hands, waited for him, her heart heavy. Rodrigo approached, and the silence between them was filled with the pain of the past and the hope of the future. He said nothing, just looked at her with a gaze that was no longer cold, but filled with deep sadness. "I read the diary," he said, his voice choked. "I know everything." Her confession, which he had feared, was received with the sadness of forgiveness. The conversation that followed was a balm for their wounds. They didn't attack each other, but comforted each other. Isabella explained her mother's pain, the guilt that haunted her for a lifetime. Rodrigo explained his father's pain, the way he had closed himself off after his mother's death. They weren't enemies, but victims of a past that inevitably united them. They forgave each other, and by forgiving each other, they freed themselves. The winery, once the stage of their disagreements, became the site of their reconciliation. They were no longer opposites, but halves of a whole, united by pain and love. The resolution of the story wasn't just the union of Isabella and Rodrigo, but the union of tradition and modernity. They decided that the winery would not just be a business, but a legacy. Rodrigo, who once saw the winery in numbers, began to see it as a home. Isabella, who saw the winery as a sanctuary of memories, began to see it as a place of the future. They became partners, not just in life, but also in business. The reconciliation blend became the symbol of their love, a perfect mixture of tradition and modernity, of heart and reason. The bottle, once unlabeled, now had a label with a photo of the two of them, smiling genuinely. The story culminated in the union of their traumas. Isabella's mother's diary, which contained the secret, was buried by her at the foot of a grapevine, in a gesture of liberation. "The story needs to be buried so the new vintage can grow," she said, and he looked at her with eyes full of tears of joy. They kissed, and the kiss was proof that the vintage of love, the most precious of all, was ready to be harvested. The diary, now buried, was proof that the past, though painful, could no longer haunt them. From that moment on, the Almeida vineyard became a place of light. Isabella's smile was no longer a mask, but a genuine expression of happiness. Rodrigo's coldness transformed into passion. They worked together, side by side, respecting each other's opinions. He, with his business vision, modernized the winery but without losing the place's soul. She, with her passion, continued to tell the stories of the wines, but now with a new story to tell, theirs. The winery, once a place of business, became a home. They got married in a simple ceremony in the middle of the vineyard under the starry sky. The wedding, which didn't have the luxury of a big event, had the love of a great couple. The Almeida vineyard became the stage for their story, and the story, proof that love can arise in the most unexpected places and that forgiveness is the only way to heal the wounds of the past. They became one, a story that would be told for generations. Their life was a wine that aged, becoming more sublime. Each day, each year, a new vintage was harvested, a new wine was produced, and a new chapter of their story was written. The Almeida vineyard became a place of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Their love story was the story of the winery, and the winery was their story. With each new wine, a new memory was created, a new love story was told. And the love they had so feared became the only thing that saved them, healed them, and united them. Their story was proof that love is the only thing that can fill the void of the past.